بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم نحمده ونصلي على رسوله الكريم أما بعد قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في القرآن المجيد بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم فإذا فرغت فانصب إلى ربك فارغب صدق الله العظيم. Every Thursdays we have our Tazkiyah program, and just as it's mentioned, Tazkiyah is a fundamental part of Islam, and it is involved with every single aspect of the Sharia. There are many parts to Tazkiyah, but the main components and the whole gist of Tazkiyah is that a person connects himself with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in order for a person to connect himself with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he must follow Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's wishes. And in order to follow Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's wishes, he must know what Allah wants from him, and he must know what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala dislikes from him. So all the do's which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded a person to do, he needs to carry out, and all the don'ts which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prohibited a person, he needs to stay away from. So this process of carrying out all the do's and abstaining from all the don'ts, this process will acquire and bring the closeness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in essence, the objective of our life and purpose of our life is to create that connection with Allah, to acquire Allah's pleasure, to acquire Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's love and His closeness. Among those things which will help a person bring Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's closeness is bringing into his life all of those prescribed practices which the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the Sahaba radiyallahu anhum had in their lives. In the verse which I recited before you, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَإِذَا فَرَغْتَ فَانْصَبْ إِلَىٰ رَبِّكَ فَارْغَب. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is being addressed, and he's being told that when you finish with your daily Islamic, your daily Dini engagements, then allocate an exclusive time solely for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, during his day, he would engage in multiple and different type of Dini obligations and Dini responsibilities. For example, he would engage in teaching. He would engage in nurturing and training the Sahaba radiyallahu ta'ala anhum. He would engage in the affairs of the Islamic State. He would engage in battle. He would engage in miscellaneous and different type of Islamic works. And every single type of work which the Prophet ﷺ did, either in the form of calling people towards Islam, in the form of purifying the Sahaba radiyallahu anhum, or teaching others, all of these works involved others, other people. He would deal with other people. So this in itself is worship, but this is called worship by means, or worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by external means. This is one type of worship. And the other type of worship is worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala without any means, rather worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala directly. So in this verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is addressing the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that when you are finished with all of your Islamic and your Dini engagements, and you are finished with this type of worship, then allocate an exclusive time to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala directly. And this usually happens at night because a person is free at night. His engagements no longer exist whether a person is studying at school, whether he's working, or whether he's engaging in Islamic work. The time to work is a day period, and the time to rest is a night period. But in this verse, the Prophet ﷺ is being told that in the night, allocate an exclusive time and only worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this worship is known as direct worship, not indirect worship. The day worship, the day obligations are worship through means or indirect worship. But the night worship is direct worship. How is the night worship direct worship? The Prophet ﷺ would engage in salah, tahajjud, qiyamul layl, and he would make this connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala without any means. Now he's directly conversing with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Before he was teaching to the companions, before he was leading the affairs, before he was managing the affairs of the state. But in the night, he was directly conversing, directly associating with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the form of salah, qiyamul layl, tahajjud, in the form of recitation of the Quran, in the form of dhikr, remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the form of dua, calling out to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and crying out to Allah subhanahu, oh Allah, you give people guidance. This was all done during the night hours, because this is known as direct worship. And the day worship is known as indirect worship. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes mention of this concept in a verse of Surah Al-Muzammil. إِنَّ لَكَ فِي النَّهَارِ صَبْحًا طَوِيلًا وَاذْكُرِ اسْمَ رَبِّكَ وَتَبَتَّلْ إِلَيْهِ تَبْتِيلًا. During the day, you have very important and difficult tasks that you carry out. But during the night, وَاذْكُرِ اسْمَ رَبِّكَ, remember the name of your Lord. وَتَبَتَّلْ إِلَيْهِ تَبْتِيلًا, and cut yourself off from everything and focus only on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why did the Prophet ﷺ, why was he given this command? It should be that the day worship, which is the indirect worship, that should have been sufficient. Yet he was commanded to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and give Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala his exclusive and undivided attention during the night. The reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him this command is because the power of one's connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the strength and energy and benefit that a person acquires with direct worship, with allocating exclusive time with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this power, this energy, this strength, this benefit, it cannot be acquired during the day when a person is involved in indirect worship. So this power, it helps a person in his daily activities. It helps a person carry out his daily work. Many of us, we must have experienced the benefits of our prescribed practices. After the Fajr Salah, many brothers are seated in the masjid and they engage in dua, they engage in dhikr, they engage in recitation of Surah Yasin or a portion of the Quran, and that helps them throughout the entire day. Many brothers, they don't manifest themselves, but they perform tahajjud at night. They worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at night. And again, this helps them during the day, whether it's worldly occupations or whether it's Islamic occupations. We see the benefits appear more in Islamic occupations, in Islamic work. But nonetheless, this was the practice of the Prophet ﷺ, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala pointed this out. When the Sahaba radiyallahu ta'ala anhum were described to the enemies of Islam, these words were known. These words were used. وَبِاللَّيْلِ رُحْبَانٌ وَبِالنَّهَارِ فُرْسَانٌ. That during the night, they become like monks. They become extreme, zealous worshippers. And during the day, they are fighting and they are engaging in battle. So this was very shocking to the enemy, that how can These people, the Sahaba radiallahu ta'ala anhum, fight so viciously during the day, and then at night they become like complete monks and priests. How is that even possible? But that was a condition. During the night, they would connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that connection would help them during the day gaining victory over the non-Muslims. Even up to this very day, this was, and this will continue to be the practice of the pious predecessors. During the night, they would occupy themselves in exclusive direct worship, and during the day, they would carry out their religious Islamic duties and obligations with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But they would never ever let this practice go. Whereas this practice of engaging in worship at night is not fard, it's not necessary, it's not wajib. At the most, it can be said that it's nafal, it's optional, it's mustahab, it's preferable. Yet, this practice was held on by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Sahaba radiallahu ta'ala anhum, the Tabi'in, the Tabu Tabi'in, and our righteous pious predecessors. Because they knew that the power and strength that they would acquire through these nafal and mustahab actions will help them in their farad and wajib actions. The work of Tazkiyah, the work of dawah and tabligh, the work of ta'aleem, in their day-to-day lives. I just want to quote a few incidents to highlight the importance of maintaining a close connection with one's prescribed daily practices. A very great sheikh of Pakistan, Shaykhul Islam, Hazrat Maulana Mufti Taqi Usmani Sahab, Damat Barakatum. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given him a lot of knowledge, a lot of wisdom, and the sheikh has done extensive work, and he has given innumerable services towards Islam. The sheikh was once traveling in a car, and it was the sheikh's practice that he would recite the Quran on a daily basis. So my respected teacher was traveling with him. Once the car reached the motorway, the highway, the sheikh took permission from the other companions in the car that I have a practice of reciting the Quran every single day. If you don't mind, please allow me to finish my practice. So as the car was traveling, the sheikh continued his recitation. He finished his Quran. After recitation of the Quran, he said that coincidentally, today was the day of completion. So if you allow me, I will make a collective dua and supplication. So a collective dua and supplication was made, and all the companions and the other people in the vehicle, they participated in this auspicious dua and supplication. So the sheikh, despite traveling, he still completed his prescribed practices. Again, this is not fard, it's not necessary, it's not even wajib. It's nafal, it's optional, it's mustahab, it's preferable, but our pious predecessors, our pious ulama, they would not let go of these small little practices because they knew the effects that these small optional practices would bring in their lives. Another incident of another great sheikh, the sheikh of Hazrat Mufti Taqi Usmani Sahab, Hazrat Dr. Abdullahi Arifi Rahimahullah Ta'ala, who was a very great sheikh in Karachi. He was a khalifa of Hazrat Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanvi Rahimahullah Ta'ala. So they were once traveling as well, and it was the practice of the sheikh that after the Maghrib Salah, he would engage in his dhikr, tasbihat, recitation of the Quran, whatever practices he had set practices, and he would engage in those practices every single day after the Maghrib Salah. So during that day, they were busy because they were traveling. So he was unable to carry out his prescribed practices. So this continued all the way until the Isha Salah. After the Isha Salah, the likes of Mufti Taqi Usmani Sahab, Damat Barakatum, he was traveling with him. He noticed that the sheikh did not get up from his seat after the sunnah and the witr. Rather, he stayed seated for a very long time. And once he got up, and when he went to the back, he asked his companions, do you know what I just did? Everyone said no. The Shaykh said, I made up for my prescribed practices, which I would normally carry out after the Maghrib Salah. But because we were occupied with other work, I could not fulfill that. So again, from the Sharia perspective, a person does not even have to make up something which is not farad. But these fortunate individuals, these pious and righteous individuals, they knew that once a practice is in place, we should carry that practice out because this brings power, this brings strength to our daily activities. So in the same manner, the Prophet ﷺ, it was his general practice to perform the tahajjud salat. And although we find different narrations were in respect to the number of raka'at, but the general consensus is that he used to perform 8 raka'at of tahajjud very consistently. So at times he would perform 2, at times he would perform 4, at times he would perform 6, and at times, or most of the times he would perform 8. Again, this was not necessary. And we find these words in the hadith that the Prophet ﷺ's feet used to swell. His feet used to swell because of standing for long hours in prayer before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Again, this was not a farad prayer because in the farad salawat, there are specific rules which the imam has to follow. The nafal prayer, it has more flexibility in terms of if a person would like to lengthen his nafal salah, lengthen his ruku, lengthen his sajda, he may do so. So again, it's advised that a person should consult the ulama ikram in respect to the exact method. But nonetheless, the Prophet ﷺ would give importance to his nafal actions. And it's mentioned in the hadith, in the hereafter, if there is deficiency in a person's farad and wajib actions, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will ask him if he has any nafal actions available. If he has nafal actions available, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will take that deficiency and he'll make it up. And if there are no nafal actions, then how can that deficiency be made up? And the Sahaba radiyallahu ta'ala were of the same nature. All the muhaddithin, all the fuqaha, every single one of them, or majority of them, they would engage in the qiyamul layl. They would engage in the tahajjud salah. They would engage in reciting the Quran excessively, both inside the month of Ramadan and likewise outside the month of Ramadan. So whatever prescribed practices we have, first and foremost, we should hold on to these prescribed practices. We shouldn't let them go. Number 2, these prescribed practices should consist of a range of different actions. And our ulama ikram mashayikh usually advise that a person should have a specific and a set portion of his recitation of the Quran. And it's usually advised by the senior ulama ikram, if a person is a hafid, he should recite 3 juz, 3 chapters every single day. And for non-huffaz, they should recite at least 1 juz every single day by heart. And if a person is a non-hafid, then it's advised that he recites, by looking inside, at least 1 chapter and 1 juz of the Quran. If that's difficult for him, then half a chapter. If that's difficult, then at least a quarter of a chapter every single day. But that quarter or half or 1 juz or 3 juz, it should be done on a regular basis with consistency. So these are all practices. And my respected teacher and sheikh beautifully mentions, once the practice is fixed, then a time should be fixed. For example, I will not get up after the Fajr Salah until my practice is complete. Only then will that practice be complete. And mashallah, it's seen that many brothers, they don't get up from their seats until their prescribed practices are finished. and some who have to go for work, as they're leaving, they are engaged in dhikr. So fix the practice, number one. And number two, allocate a time. And number three, do not get up from your seat until that practice is complete. Only then will these practices become complete. So these nafal practices, mustahab practices, they hold a lot of value. And these help a person in his daily worship. They make the fard and wajib very strong. And I'll just give one example before I conclude. An example, a very beautiful example with which a very great sheikh known as Hazrat Mufti Ahmad Khan Puri Sahab, Damat Barakatum. He is the head sheikh in Dabel, Gujarat, a very great mufti. He would address the people of knowledge and he would address the people of Islam and the people of Deen and who are engaged in Islamic works and Islamic obligations. And he gave a very beautiful example. The sheikh said that once there was a man who would cut wood and he was looking for employment. So he went to the jungle and he spoke to the owner of the jungle if he could work for him. So the owner of the jungle, the person who was in charge of the business, he said, okay, here's an axe, go cut a tree for me. So he went and he cut a tree for him very efficiently and very quickly. This person was taken aback. He was very pleased with his services. So he employed him. So on the first day, for example, he cut 30 trees. Second day, 30 trees. Day 3, 30 trees. Day 4, he cut 28 trees. Day 5, he cut 27 trees. Day 6, he cut 24 trees. And day 7, he cut 20 trees. So now the manager, the boss, he was very concerned. And he called him to his office and he said, why do I see that there is a deficiency in the number of trees that you are cutting? The first 3 days went very well. 30, 30, 30. Day 4, day 5, day 6, day 7. Slowly, the number of trees started to decline. So he asked him, that, are you making the same effort that you did on day 1? He said, yes. I'm putting in the exact same hours. I'm putting in the same amount of effort. So he said, okay, bring your axe here. He showed him the axe, and he looked very carefully at the blade. The blade was dull. He said, okay, I understand. So he sharpened the blade for him, and he said, go and cut wood again. And again, mashallah, 30 trees every single day. So the great Sheikh Mufti Ahmad Khan Puri Sahab Damat Barakatum, he explains that our heart and our tongue is like this blade as well. If we don't work on our heart, then that same efficiency, that same result, that same output will not be there. And the example that is given is those who are engaged in dawah and tabligh. For example, if there are 100 people sitting in the gathering and only 5 people stand up to give their names, that means, for example, that work needs to be done here first and then there afterwards. If a person works here, then even if there's a gathering of 50 people, 45 of those people will stand up and give their names. And here we have a gathering of 100 and only 5 are standing up and giving their names. Another example, ulama ikram, they give talks in the form of Dars Quran, Dars Hadith, Tazkiyah programs, seminars, conferences, etc., etc., etc. If we want a revolution and a change in people's lives, the change first has to be here. If the change is made here, then that change will have an effect on people's hearts. Because this heart and this tongue is like a blade. The sharper the blade is, the powerful the output will be. Khaja Mu'inuddin Ajmiri, rahimallahu ta'ala, when he traveled to India, 90,000 people accepted Islam on his hands. And the Sheikh did not know even one single word that the native community would speak. Neither could the sheikh understand the native language, and neither could the native people understand what the sheikh is saying. So the question arises that how did 90,000 people accept Islam on his hands? The answer which our mashayikh gave is that his blade was extremely powerful. And this is seen among many of our mashayikh. Haji Imdadullah Muhajir Makki, who was a sheikh of Hazrat Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanwi, Hazrat Maulana Rashid Ahmad Gangohi, and Hazrat Maulana Qasim Nanotwi Rahimullah. Hazrat Maulana Qasim Nanotwi, he was the founder of Darul Uloom Deoband. And every single madrasa Darul Uloom which came into existence is a branch of Darul Uloom Deoband, which started out in 1856. So the founder of that institute was Hazrat Maulana Qasim Nanotwi Rahimullah Ta'ala. Hazrat Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanwi Rahimullah Ta'ala is probably one of the greatest sheikhs in the entire universe. Every single alami haq will quote him. A genius in every single field. Quran, Hadith, Fiqh, Tariq, Siyasat. The man was a genius. And he passed away, I believe, in 1943 or 1944. I believe it was 1943. If you pick up his books and you apply his statements to today's situations, everything will apply exactly how it was said 80, 90 years ago. No difference. I'll just give you one example. The Shaykh beautifully says, Siyasat is combined and made up of two words. So it's an Urdu word. It's made up of siyah. Siyah means blackness, and it's made up of sat. So siyah, sat. Siyah means blackness, sat means truthfulness. The Shaykh beautifully says that the word siyasat, although it's made up of two words, the second word, which means truthfulness, that has vanished. And the first word, blackness, has remained. This is a reality of siyasat, politics. This was said 90 years ago. And in light of what's happening today, especially with all of that nonsense on mainstream media, it's very easy to understand the reality of politics, just in one simple word. So nonetheless, Mufti Ahmad Khan Puri Sahib, down to Rakatam, explains that the stronger a person's heart is, the stronger his blade becomes. The stronger his blade becomes, the stronger the benefit and stronger the output becomes. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala enable us to understand and practice. Wa akhiru da'wana an alhamdulillah sadaqallahu al-azim. Jazakumullah.